The night air above the Nile River moved slowly. Long after the heat of the day had faded from the fields and the stone roads, a soft wind drifted across the dark water. The river itself made very little sound. It simply flowed, as it always had, carrying bits of reed, fragments of moonlight, and the quiet reflections of distant villages sleeping beneath the stars. Somewhere along the riverbank, a dog barked once and then became silent again. In a small mud-brick home, a family slept close together on woven mats laid across the floor. The day's work had ended many hours ago. The cooking fire had burned low. The smell of bread, dust, smoke, and river water still lingered softly in the air. Tomorrow would begin before sunrise. For most people living in ancient Egypt, tomorrow always began before sunrise. When many people imagine childhood in the ancient world, they often picture freedom. They imagine children running through fields, swimming in the Nile, or playing beneath palm trees while adults worked nearby. And sometimes these moments did happen. Children laughed. They played games. They chased each other through narrow village streets and threw pebbles into irrigation canals. But these moments existed inside a world built entirely around labor, survival, and routine. Childhood, as we understand it today, did not really exist. In ancient Egypt, a child was not seen as someone who would spend many years discovering themselves or exploring their interests. A child was someone who would slowly, and then very quickly, become another worker. And so tonight, as the stars hang quietly above the Nile River, we travel into that forgotten world. A world where childhood was brief. A world where growing up began almost as soon as life itself. The first light of morning usually arrived long before anyone could see the sun. The eastern horizon would slowly become pale gray. The stars would begin to disappear. The air, still cool from the night, carried the smell of wet earth and river plants. Inside thousands of homes across Egypt, adults began to wake. Children woke too. There were no soft mornings. No long moments spent resting beneath blankets. The floor beneath their sleeping mats was hard-packed earth. The walls around them were made of dried mud bricks. During the night, the air might have cooled enough to bring comfort, but soon the heat would return. A mother might rise first. She would move quietly through the darkness, careful not to disturb younger children still sleeping. She would prepare grain. She would tend to the small cooking fire. She would grind flour using heavy stone tools that had already worn smooth after years of use. The sound of grinding stone became one of the first sounds many children ever learned to recognize. It was the sound of morning. As children grew older, they joined these routines almost immediately. A very young child might carry water. Another might collect fuel. Another might help prepare grain or clean cooking vessels. No task was considered too small because every task mattered. In the villages along the Nile, survival depended upon countless ordinary actions repeated every day, every month, every year. A child learned this quickly. The Nile River itself shaped everything. Its annual floods brought life. Its waters fed crops. Its banks created pathways for merchants, fishermen, farmers, priests, and workers of every kind. For children growing up near the river, the Nile was not simply beautiful. It was work. Before they fully understood the world around them, they understood the rhythm of the river. They learned when the waters rose. They learned when fields were planted. They learned when harvests began. They learned how quickly hunger could arrive if work was neglected. In farming villages, boys and girls both participated in labor from an early age. A small child might spend hours following older siblings through fields of barley or wheat. At first, they watched. Then they carried baskets. Eventually, they performed the same exhausting tasks as the adults around them. The Egyptian sun was powerful. By midday, heat settled over the land like a heavy blanket. Dust clung to skin. Sandals wore thin against hard ground. Sweat dried almost as quickly as it appeared. Yet work continued. Children learned to accept exhaustion as a normal part of life. Sometimes, while working in the fields, a child might stop for a moment and look toward the distant river. The water shimmered beneath the sunlight. Birds moved quietly above the reeds. Palm trees swayed gently in the hot wind. For a brief moment, there was beauty. Then work began again. Many families lived in homes that would feel very small to us today. A single room might serve multiple purposes. People slept there, cooked there, stored food there, raised children there. Privacy was rare. Quiet was rare. Life unfolded close together. At night, entire families rested side by side beneath the warm darkness. Children listened to the sounds of adults speaking softly. They listened to distant animals. They listened to the wind moving across rooftops. Eventually, they fell asleep knowing that tomorrow would resemble today almost exactly. And there was comfort in that certainty. In cities, childhood looked different, but not necessarily easier. Ancient Egyptian cities were busy places. Workshops filled narrow streets. Merchants shouted in crowded markets. Craftsmen shaped wood, metal, stone, leather, and cloth. The air smelled of smoke, sweat, cooking food, and dust. Children growing up in cities entered this world very early. A child born into a family of potters often became a potter. A child born into a family of fishermen often became a fisherman. A child born into a household of scribes might someday become a scribe. Life paths were not always chosen. Often, they were inherited. Imagine a young boy walking behind his father before sunrise. The streets are still dark. The air remains cool. He carries tools that feel heavy in his hands. His father walks ahead without speaking much. This journey has happened hundreds of times before. Soon they arrive at a workshop. The fires are lit. The work begins. Hours pass. The sun rises. The room grows hotter. Dust fills the air. The boy watches. He learns. He repeats. Day after day. Year after year. And eventually, without realizing exactly when it happened, he becomes another worker among many workers. Girls experienced a similar transition. From a young age, many learned household responsibilities. They prepared food. They carried water. They cared for younger children. They spun fibers. They cleaned. They organized storage jars. They learned to maintain the countless small routines that allowed a household to survive. These tasks required strength. They required patience. They required endurance. A girl's education often came through observation. She watched her mother. She copied movements. She memorized routines. She learned which tasks belonged to morning and which belonged to evening. She learned how long bread should bake. She learned how much water a family needed. She learned how to recognize illness, exhaustion, and hunger. Childhood slowly disappeared inside these lessons. And yet, there were still moments of softness. There were evenings. After long days, when the heat finally began to fade, families sometimes gathered outside their homes. The air cooled. The sky turned orange and then purple. The Nile reflected the last light of the sun. Adults spoke quietly. Children rested nearby. Some played games scratched into stone surfaces. Others simply lay on their backs and watched birds disappear into the distance. These moments did not erase hardship, but they existed alongside it. Ancient Egyptian childhood was not only labor. It was also family. It was routine. It was familiarity. It was the comfort of knowing exactly what tomorrow would bring. Yet even these peaceful evenings contained reminders of how fragile life could be. Illness was common. Injuries happened frequently. Children worked around tools, animals, water, fire, and heavy loads. Not every child survived into adulthood. Families understood this reality deeply. Perhaps because of this, family bonds often became incredibly important. Parents cared deeply for their children. Children cared deeply for their parents. Love existed. Affection existed. But affection lived inside a world where survival always came first. As darkness returned to the Nile Valley, workers finished their final tasks. Fishing boats drifted back toward shore. Farmers returned from the fields. Craftsmen extinguished their fires. Merchants counted what little remained of the day. Children returned home beside them. Their feet hurt. Their hands were dirty. Their bodies were tired. The evening meal was often simple. Bread. Beer made from grain. Vegetables. Sometimes fish. Sometimes dates. Sometimes very little. After eating, families prepared once more for sleep. The stars appeared slowly. The temperature dropped. The sounds of the village softened. One by one, voices disappeared. And somewhere inside the darkness of ancient Egypt, a child lay awake for a few extra moments. Perhaps they listened to the wind moving outside the house. Perhaps they heard water in the distance. Perhaps they thought about tomorrow's work. Or perhaps they thought about nothing at all. Because tomorrow would arrive soon. And childhood, in ancient Egypt, was never truly separate from the world of adults. It was simply the beginning of it. As the night deepened across the Nile Valley, the air became cooler for a few precious hours. The heat that had pressed heavily against walls, fields, and bodies throughout the day slowly drifted upward into the darkness. In villages scattered along the riverbanks, sleeping families rested beneath open windows or beneath the stars themselves, hoping to capture whatever comfort the night could offer. But even during these quiet hours, ancient Egypt never became completely still. Somewhere, water moved gently through irrigation channels. Somewhere, a watchman walked slowly along a wall of mud brick, carrying a small lamp whose flame bent softly in the wind. Somewhere, fishermen prepared nets before dawn, knowing that the river would soon call them back to work. And inside countless homes, children slept with the knowledge that morning always arrived sooner than expected. For children born into fishing families, life followed the rhythm of the Nile even more closely than for anyone else. The river was not simply nearby. It was everywhere. Its smell lingered in clothing. Its water filled storage jars. Its sounds drifted through open doorways during the night. Its changing levels determined whether families ate well or struggled through difficult seasons. A young child might first visit the riverbank while still small enough to be carried. At first, they observed. They watched adults untangle nets with practiced hands. They watched boats drift through morning fog. They listened to quiet conversations spoken between fishermen before sunrise. Eventually, observation became participation. A child learned how to carry baskets. They learned how to gather reeds. They learned how to repair damaged rope and remove fish from woven traps. The work was repetitive. The work was physical. The work seemed endless. Yet because everyone around them had always done the same things, it rarely felt unusual. Before dawn, the river often appeared silver beneath the fading stars. The air carried the smell of mud, water plants, fish, and damp earth. Bare feet pressed into soft riverbanks. Wooden boats creaked gently against their moorings. Children standing beside their parents during these early hours probably felt both sleepy and awake at the same time. The world was quiet. The work had already begun. As the sun climbed higher, the coolness disappeared. Heat spread slowly across the water. The sky became bright and empty. The labor continued. For farming families, the cycle of work depended heavily on the season. The annual flooding of the Nile shaped every aspect of life. When the flood waters arrived, they transformed the landscape. Fields disappeared beneath dark water. Paths vanished. The boundaries between river and land became difficult to see. For children, these months could feel mysterious. The familiar world changed shape. Boats traveled where people normally walked. The air smelled rich and wet. The earth itself seemed to sleep beneath the flood. But this period of waiting was not a holiday. There were always tasks. Tools needed repair. Storage areas needed cleaning. Animals required care. Homes required maintenance. Children worked alongside adults, learning not only what to do, but also when to do it. Timing mattered. Patience mattered. Observation mattered. As the waters eventually retreated, another rhythm began. Fields had to be prepared. Seeds had to be planted. The entire community moved together, following patterns established over countless generations. Children walked behind adults carrying baskets of seed. They watched feet sink into moist earth. They listened to instructions repeated again and again. Throw the seed here. Walk carefully there. Carry this. Bring that. Work became education. Education became work. For a child growing up in ancient Egypt, there was rarely a clear boundary between learning and labor. Some children, however, entered a different world. These were the children who became scribes. Their lives were not easy, but they followed another path. A young boy chosen to study writing entered a world of discipline, memory, and repetition. He sat for long hours. He copied symbols again and again. He learned to hold brushes carefully. He learned to prepare ink. He learned to read words written by hands that had long since disappeared. The rooms where scribes studied were often quiet. Not silent, but quiet in a different way than fields or workshops. There was the sound of brushes against writing surfaces. The sound of breathing. The occasional voice of a teacher correcting a mistake. Outside, the sun continued its journey across the sky. Inside, children bent over their work. Their backs hurt. Their hands became tired. Their eyes strained in dim light. Even education carried exhaustion. Yet many families viewed this path as a blessing. Physical labor shaped most lives. A scribe's life, though difficult, often promised greater security. Still, childhood remained brief. A young student did not study because of personal dreams or self-discovery. He studied because a role awaited him. Everyone belonged somewhere. Everyone had work to do. As evening approached across Egypt, another transformation occurred. The unbearable heat slowly loosened its grip. Long shadows stretched across fields. The light turned golden. Workers began their journeys home. Children walked beside parents or older siblings. Their pace was slower now. The energy of morning had long since disappeared. Dust covered their feet. Their shoulders ached. Their stomachs were empty. Yet these walks home sometimes became the quietest and gentlest moments of the day. Birds settled among reeds. The river reflected the changing sky. Palm trees swayed softly in the evening breeze. For a few moments, nobody hurried. Back inside their homes, families prepared the evening meal. Grinding stones moved once again. Bread baked slowly. The smell of smoke filled the air. Children fetched water, gathered supplies, and helped complete the final tasks of the day. Then, gradually, work ended. The darkness returned. Stars appeared. Voices became softer. A tired child stretched out on a woven mat and listened to the familiar sounds surrounding them. A parent speaking quietly. A baby breathing. Wind brushing against mud-brick walls. The distant sound of water moving through the eternal river. Tomorrow would come. The work would continue. And somewhere between childhood and adulthood, between play and labor, between dreams and routine, another day in ancient Egypt quietly came to rest beneath the stars. As one day ended beside the Nile, another quietly prepared to begin. The stars above ancient Egypt were bright and countless. Without the lights of later ages, the night sky stretched from one horizon to the other like a dark river filled with silver. Children often fell asleep beneath that sky, either inside warm mud-brick homes or on rooftops where the air felt cooler. The rooftop was one of the few places where relief could sometimes be found. After a long day of labor, families climbed narrow stairways carrying mats, blankets, and small oil lamps. The stone beneath their feet still held the warmth of the sun. The air smelled of dust, distant water, and the fading smoke of cooking fires. Children lay beside parents, brothers, sisters, and grandparents. There was little privacy. There was little space. But there was closeness. A child might stare upward for several minutes before sleep arrived. They might listen to adults speaking softly about crops, taxes, repairs, weather, or tomorrow's work. They might hear the occasional cry of an animal somewhere in the darkness. They might feel the warm night wind moving gently across their face. Then, slowly, sleep would come. And before long, sleep would end. Ancient Egyptian childhood was shaped by repetition. The same roads. The same fields. The same workshops. The same tasks. The same rising sun. To modern eyes, such repetition might appear exhausting. But to the people who lived through it, routine created stability. Knowing what tomorrow would bring offered a certain comfort in a world where many other things remained uncertain. For children, this meant that growing older happened almost invisibly. There was rarely a moment when someone announced that childhood had ended. Instead, responsibilities simply increased. A boy who once carried small baskets eventually carried large ones. A girl who once watched bread being prepared eventually prepared it herself. A child who once followed adults into the fields eventually became the adult leading others. The change happened slowly. Then suddenly. In villages throughout Egypt, children spent countless hours carrying water. This was one of the most ordinary tasks of daily life. And because it was ordinary, it was essential. The Nile gave life to Egypt, but the river did not deliver water directly into every home. Water had to be gathered, carried, stored, and protected. Children walked familiar paths toward the riverbank carrying jars made from clay. Some jars were small enough for younger children. Others were heavy enough to leave deep marks on shoulders and arms. The journey itself became part of childhood. The path beneath their feet. The smell of wet earth. The sound of insects in the reeds. The distant voices of fishermen. The sight of sunlight reflecting off the water. These experiences repeated thousands of times over a lifetime. During the hottest months of the year, even simple tasks became difficult. The Egyptian sun was relentless. By midday, the air itself seemed to stop moving. The ground became painfully hot. Walls radiated heat long after sunset. Workers rested whenever they could, searching for shade beneath trees, beside walls, or under simple shelters made of reeds. Children rested too. But rest did not always mean sleep. Sometimes it meant simply sitting quietly. Sometimes it meant drinking water slowly. Sometimes it meant staring at the horizon while waiting for enough strength to continue. Heat shaped childhood as surely as family or work did. Children learned to recognize exhaustion early. They learned the feeling of heavy legs. They learned the ache of sore muscles. They learned that work continued despite discomfort. And yet, despite the labor, moments of play still appeared. Children created games from whatever existed around them. They tossed stones. They drew patterns in the dirt. They raced one another through village streets. They played with carved wooden figures, cloth dolls, or simple objects made by hand. These moments were brief. But they mattered. A child's laughter echoed differently than the sounds of labor. For a short time, work disappeared. For a short time, they simply became children. Then the moment passed. The tasks returned. In larger towns and cities, children experienced another kind of world. The streets were crowded. The air carried many smells at once. Fresh bread baking in clay ovens. Smoke rising from workshops. Animals moving through narrow roads. Fish drying beneath the sun. Perfume sellers displaying oils and herbs. The city never truly rested. Children growing up in these places learned to navigate noise, crowds, and constant activity. Many worked inside family businesses. Others carried messages. Some assisted merchants. Others worked alongside craftsmen. A young apprentice might spend years learning a single trade. A carpenter's child learned wood. A metal worker's child learned metal. A textile worker's child learned cloth. Knowledge passed through families like inheritance itself. There were no long periods of exploration. No years spent deciding what path to follow. The path usually already existed. All that remained was to walk it. For many children, illness also became part of ordinary life. The ancient world was beautiful. But it was also fragile. A fever could arrive unexpectedly. An injury could change everything. A simple infection could become dangerous. Families understood this because they experienced it often. Parents worried. Children recovered. Sometimes they did not. This uncertainty shaped how people viewed each day. Work continued because it had to continue. Food had to be prepared. Fields had to be maintained. Animals had to be cared for. The river continued flowing regardless of human suffering. And so, children learned resilience not because they were taught it, but because they lived within it. As evening approached once more, shadows stretched across the land. The sounds of labor slowly faded. Boats returned. Farmers walked home. Workers left workshops carrying their tools. Children walked beside them. The air cooled little by little. The sky changed from bright gold to deep orange. Dust settled. Birds disappeared into palm trees. Families gathered again. The evening meal was prepared. Bread was broken. Water was shared. Stories were spoken quietly. Not grand stories of kings and monuments. Not tales of conquest or glory. Instead, they spoke about ordinary things. A harvest. A neighbor. The weather. A sick animal. Tomorrow's work. Children listened. Sometimes they spoke. Sometimes they simply rested. And as darkness settled once more over the Nile Valley, another ordinary day disappeared into memory. For most children in ancient Egypt, greatness was never expected. Fame was never expected. Freedom was never expected. What was expected was endurance. What was expected was responsibility. What was expected was that one day, quietly and without ceremony, childhood would give way to the long and familiar rhythms of adult life. And beneath the endless stars above the ancient river, that transformation happened every single day. Before the sun rose over the Nile Valley, there was a brief period of stillness. The sky remained dark, but not completely black. Along the eastern horizon, a faint gray light slowly appeared, spreading quietly over the river, the fields, and the sleeping villages. During these moments, the world seemed to pause. Then, little by little, ancient Egypt woke once again. A rooster called somewhere in the distance. A donkey shifted in its enclosure. A cooking fire crackled softly as someone added dry reeds to the flames. And inside thousands of homes, children opened their eyes to another day that would look very much like the day before. For many children, there was comfort in this repetition. The world felt predictable. The same walls surrounded them. The same people shared their meals. The same tasks awaited them. Yet that comfort came with responsibility. From a very young age, children understood that their efforts mattered. If water was not collected, someone would go thirsty. If grain was not prepared, someone would go hungry. If animals were not cared for, the family could suffer. These were not lessons taught through long conversations. They were learned through daily experience. A child watched. A child copied. A child worked. And slowly, the child became part of the great machinery of ordinary life. In farming communities, the changing seasons shaped every aspect of childhood. There were periods of planting. There were periods of waiting. There were periods of harvest. Each season carried its own sounds, smells, and routines. During harvest time, the fields became crowded with activity. The air filled with dust and the scent of dry grain. Workers moved in long lines beneath the sun. Children participated wherever they could. Some gathered fallen stalks. Some carried baskets. Some helped transport supplies. The work lasted for hours. The heat pressed heavily against their bodies. Their feet became sore. Their hands became rough. Yet stopping was rarely an option. The harvest had to be completed. Food for the coming months depended upon it. As the sun climbed higher into the sky, the landscape itself seemed to shimmer. The horizon blurred beneath the heat. Birds sought shade. Even the wind appeared to slow. Workers paused briefly whenever possible. Children sat beside adults beneath small shelters or under the limited shade of trees. They drank water carefully. They ate simple meals. Bread. Onions. Dates. Sometimes fish. Often, silence accompanied these meals. Not because anyone was unhappy, but because everyone was tired. There was a particular kind of exhaustion that became familiar in ancient Egypt. It was not dramatic. It was not unusual. It simply existed. Children grew up knowing this feeling. They accepted it as part of life. For children who lived near construction sites or large building projects, childhood carried another set of experiences. Ancient Egypt was constantly building. Temples rose slowly from the earth. Storage buildings expanded. Canals required maintenance. Homes needed repairs. Walls had to be rebuilt. Large projects involved thousands of workers. Children often accompanied their families to these places. At first, they observed. They watched stone being cut. They watched ropes pull enormous blocks across the ground. They watched craftsmen shape wood and carve stone. The sounds remained with them. Hammering. Scraping. Voices calling instructions. The movement of heavy objects across earth and sand. As they grew older, observation became participation. A child carried tools. A child fetched water. A child cleaned work areas. A child learned that every great structure rested upon countless ordinary tasks performed by ordinary people. The monuments that survived for thousands of years were built not only by kings and architects, but also by tired workers and their children. For young boys training in specialized crafts, apprenticeship shaped nearly every hour of life. The workshop became a second home. Its smells became familiar. Fresh cut wood, hot metal, leather, smoke, oil, dust. The workshop also carried its own sounds. Tools striking stone. Saw blades moving through wood. The quiet conversations of experienced craftsmen. The occasional correction delivered by a master worker. Learning a craft required patience. Mistakes wasted valuable materials. Mistakes required additional labor. Children learned through repetition. Again and again. Day after day. Month after month. Years passed this way. The same was true for many girls learning household management. A household in ancient Egypt required constant attention. Water storage. Food preparation. Cleaning. Repairing clothing. Caring for younger children. Organizing supplies. Nothing happened automatically. Everything required effort. Young girls observed these routines from their earliest years. Eventually, they performed them independently. The transition often happened so gradually that no one noticed exactly when it occurred. One day, a child helped prepare bread. Another day, she prepared it herself. One day, a child carried a small water jar. Another day, she carried the larger one. Childhood quietly moved forward. There were festivals, of course. There were celebrations. There were days when work slowed and communities gathered together. For children, these occasions must have felt extraordinary. The streets became more crowded. Music drifted through the air. Food became more plentiful. People dressed in their best clothing. For a brief period, ordinary routines softened. Children laughed more freely. Families spent time together. The heavy rhythm of labor paused, if only for a short while. Yet even festivals eventually ended. The music faded. The crowds dispersed. The ordinary world returned. And perhaps this made those moments even more precious. As evening approached once again, smoke rose from cooking fires throughout the Nile Valley. The air cooled gradually. The light became softer. Workers returned home. Children returned home. The familiar sounds of evening began. Grinding grain. Preparing bread. Quiet conversations. The rustling of reeds in the distance. A child sitting outside a mud-brick home might watch the sun disappear beyond the horizon. The sky would slowly transform. Gold became orange. Orange became purple. Purple became black. The first stars appeared. Then hundreds more. The air smelled of earth cooling after a long day of heat. For a few moments, there were no tasks left to complete. No baskets to carry. No fields to tend. No tools to clean. Only silence. Only family. Only the great night sky stretching above the Nile. And perhaps, during these quiet moments, children experienced something that felt very close to freedom. Not the freedom of having no responsibilities. Not the freedom of escaping work. But the simple freedom of resting after a day that had demanded everything they could give. Soon enough, sleep would return. And with it, another morning waiting patiently beyond the darkness. As the night stretched over the Nile Valley, the world became softer. The heat that had filled the fields and villages during the day slowly faded into the darkness. The stars appeared brighter now, reflected faintly in the quiet water of the river. Palm trees stood motionless against the sky, and the sounds of labor, so constant during daylight hours, disappeared one by one. For many children in ancient Egypt, nighttime was the only part of the day that truly belonged to them. Not because they were free, but because work had finally stopped. Inside mud-brick homes, families settled into familiar routines. Small oil lamps flickered against rough walls. Their light was weak and golden, casting long shadows across baskets, pottery jars, sleeping mats, and wooden tools waiting for tomorrow. The evening meal had already been eaten. The bread was gone. The water jars had been covered. The cooking fire had been reduced to glowing embers. Now there was only rest. Children often slept close to everyone else in the household. Brothers, sisters, parents, grandparents, and sometimes extended family members shared the same small spaces. Privacy was uncommon, but loneliness was uncommon as well. A child drifting towards sleep might hear quiet voices nearby. A mother speaking softly. A father discussing the next day's work. Someone coughing. Someone laughing quietly. Someone already breathing with the deep rhythm of sleep. These sounds became part of childhood itself. And when morning returned, those same voices would rise once more to begin another day. For some children, however, the night brought responsibility as well. Families who owned animals needed to protect them. Fishing equipment required repair. Food supplies had to be checked. Water jars had to remain covered and secure. Even after sunset, small tasks remained. A child might hold an oil lamp while an older family member repaired a net. Another might help gather tools before sleep. Another might comfort a younger brother or sister frightened by the darkness outside. Responsibility never fully disappeared. It simply changed shape. In communities near the Nile, children developed a close relationship with the natural world around them. They understood the behavior of birds. They recognized changes in the river. They observed the movement of clouds and wind. They noticed when fish became scarce. They noticed when animals behaved differently. This knowledge was not taught through books. It was taught through observation. A child spent years watching adults pay attention to the world. Eventually, the child learned to pay attention too. The Nile itself was perhaps the greatest teacher of all. Its waters rose. Its waters fell. It nourished the land. It created uncertainty. It created security. It shaped the lives of everyone who lived beside it. Children learned very early that the river deserved respect. They played near it. They worked beside it. They depended upon it. But they also understood its power. Parents watched children carefully near the water's edge. Older siblings watched younger ones. Entire communities understood that the river that provided life could also bring danger. This awareness became another ordinary lesson of childhood. As children grew older, their bodies changed in ways that directly affected their responsibilities. Strength mattered. Endurance mattered. A child who had once carried a small bundle of reeds could now carry a heavy basket. A child who had once assisted with simple tasks could now complete them independently. No ceremony announced these changes. No celebration marked the transition. Life simply demanded more. And children responded. For boys entering adulthood, physical labor often intensified. They worked longer hours. They carried heavier loads. They traveled farther from home. Some joined groups of workers constructing buildings or maintaining irrigation systems. Others spent entire days in fields or on fishing boats. The expectations increased quietly but steadily. For girls, responsibilities within the household also expanded. They became more involved in preparing food. They cared for younger children. They managed increasingly important household duties. They learned not only how to perform tasks, but how to organize entire routines. A successful household required planning, memory, and constant effort. Young women learned these skills through years of observation and practice. In this way, childhood gradually disappeared. Not in a single moment. Not through a formal event. But through thousands of ordinary days. Thousands of mornings. Thousands of tasks. Thousands of small responsibilities accepted without question. Yet despite this constant labor, people still found ways to create beauty. Children noticed beauty too. They noticed sunlight reflecting on the Nile during early morning. They noticed birds flying low across the water. They noticed the smell of fresh bread rising from clay ovens. They noticed the feeling of cool air just before sunrise. They noticed songs sung quietly during work. Beauty existed in brief moments. Small moments. Ordinary moments. Perhaps because life was difficult, these moments became even more valuable. As evening returned once again, workers began their journey home. The sun lowered slowly across the western horizon. The light softened. Long shadows stretched over fields and roads. Children walked beside adults carrying tools, baskets, fishing nets, or bundles of grain. Their pace slowed as they approached home. The air felt cooler now. The hardest part of the day had passed. Smoke rose from village homes. Dogs barked in the distance. Birds settled into trees. The familiar sounds of evening surrounded them. Back inside their homes, lamps were lit. Meals were prepared. Conversations began. Children listened as adults discussed weather, crops, taxes, repairs, and family concerns. These conversations became part of their education. They learned how adults worried. They learned how adults planned. They learned that growing older meant carrying responsibilities not only for oneself, but for others. Later, when the lamps burned low and the household prepared for sleep, silence slowly returned. One by one, voices disappeared. The stars filled the sky. The Nile continued its endless journey through the darkness. A child lying awake for a few final moments might feel the cool night air moving gently through the room. They might hear insects singing outside. They might hear distant water. Tomorrow would arrive soon. There would be more work. There would be more responsibilities. There would be another sunrise over the river. And although childhood in ancient Egypt was never truly free, it was still filled with the quiet rhythms of family, labor, endurance, and the simple comfort of knowing that another day had ended safely beneath the stars. As the seasons passed over the Nile Valley, children grew not by counting years, but by accumulating responsibilities. There were no calendars hanging on walls to remind them of their age. There were no birthday celebrations marking the passage from one stage of life to another. Instead, time was measured through floods and harvests, through the return of migrating birds, through the wearing down of sandals, and through the gradual strengthening of hands that worked every day. A child might suddenly realize that they were now performing tasks that had once belonged only to older brothers, sisters, or parents. The realization came quietly. One morning, they were trusted to walk farther from home. Another morning, they carried a heavier load. Another day, they were expected to complete a task without supervision. And so, childhood continued to slip away, not through ceremony, but through routine. For many children living in rural Egypt, animals occupied an important place in daily life. Goats, sheep, cattle, donkeys, ducks, and geese were not simply possessions. They represented food, labor, wealth, and security. Caring for them required attention and patience. Children often became caretakers very early. Before the sun fully rose, they might lead animals toward grazing areas. They checked ropes, repaired simple fences, gathered feed, and watched carefully for signs of illness or injury. The work was not dramatic. It was repetitive. But repetition formed the foundation of life itself. A young child sitting beside grazing animals might spend hours watching the landscape around them. The warm breeze moved through tall grasses. Birds crossed the bright sky. The distant Nile reflected sunlight like polished metal. Insects hummed softly in the heat. These quiet hours may have been among the few moments when children experienced something close to solitude. Yet even solitude contained responsibility. The animals could not be ignored. Attention had to remain constant. The same was true for children who worked along the river. Fishing families depended heavily upon cooperation. A single fishing net required many hands. Boats required maintenance. Equipment required constant repair. Children learned how to tie knots, untangle rope, patch nets, and recognize changes in weather conditions. They learned how to read the river. The river always spoke. Sometimes it spoke softly, through gentle currents and calm water. Sometimes it spoke through rising floods and strong winds. Children learned to listen. At dawn, fishing boats often departed while the world still remained quiet. Mist sometimes hovered above the water. The air felt cool and damp. The sound of wooden oars entering the river created a slow, steady rhythm. A child sitting beside an older fisherman might watch the sky gradually brighten. The first birds appeared. The stars disappeared. The day began. These moments contained a kind of peace. But peace did not mean ease. Soon the work would become difficult. The sun would rise. The heat would return. The nets would grow heavy. The labor would continue. In larger towns, children encountered a different kind of complexity. Markets brought together people from many communities. The streets became crowded with merchants, craftsmen, laborers, travelers, and officials. The sounds never entirely stopped. Voices echoed between buildings. Animals moved through narrow roads. Tools struck wood and stone. Children growing up in these environments learned to move carefully through crowded spaces. They learned how to carry goods without dropping them. They learned how to negotiate prices if assisting family businesses. They learned how to observe adults and imitate their behavior. Observation remained one of the most important forms of education. Children watched everything. They watched how bread was prepared. They watched how tools were repaired. They watched how disputes were settled. They watched how respect was shown. They watched how adults endured difficult days. Through observation, children learned not only practical skills but also how to exist within their community. There were expectations. There were responsibilities. There were rules that everyone understood, even if they were never spoken aloud. Perhaps one of the most difficult aspects of childhood in ancient Egypt was the lack of separation between the adult world and the world of children. Today, many people imagine childhood as a protected period. But in ancient Egypt, children lived directly beside adult concerns. They witnessed illness. They witnessed exhaustion. They witnessed financial hardship. They witnessed grief. They witnessed the constant effort required simply to survive. This did not necessarily make childhood unhappy. But it did make childhood serious. Even moments of joy existed alongside responsibility. A child might laugh while helping harvest grain. A child might sing while carrying water. A child might play beside siblings after completing a long day of work. Joy and labor were not separate experiences. They existed together. As afternoon heat settled heavily over the land, workers often sought brief moments of rest. Children rested too. Some sat beneath palm trees. Others sheltered beside walls or beneath simple coverings made from reeds. The air shimmered. The landscape seemed to move beneath the heat. Conversations became quieter. Movements became slower. Everyone waited for the sun to begin its descent. Eventually, the light changed. The shadows lengthened. The unbearable heat slowly loosened its hold on the earth. This transition from afternoon to evening brought relief. Children felt it. Adults felt it. Even the animals seemed to feel it. The journey home began. Dust rose beneath tired feet. Tools were carried back to storage. Boats returned to shore. The sounds of labor gradually disappeared. For many children, the walk home remained one of the most memorable parts of the day. There was no urgency now. The hardest work was finished. The sky turned golden. The Nile reflected the colors of sunset. The air carried the scent of water, earth, smoke, and evening meals being prepared. Some children walked silently. Others spoke quietly with siblings or parents. These conversations were often simple. Questions about tomorrow. Comments about the weather. Observations about animals, crops, or neighbors. Nothing dramatic. Nothing extraordinary. Just ordinary life. And perhaps that was the true nature of childhood in ancient Egypt. It was not defined by grand events. It was not shaped by moments of freedom or rebellion. It was shaped by ordinary days lived over and over again. Days of labor. Days of family. Days of heat. Days of rest. Days beside the river. As darkness slowly returned once more, families gathered together inside their homes or upon their rooftops. Oil lamps flickered softly. The stars appeared. The world became quiet. A child stretched tired muscles and settled onto a woven mat. Their hands might still ache from carrying baskets. Their feet might still hurt from walking dusty roads. Their eyes slowly closed. Outside, the Nile continued its endless journey through the darkness. Tomorrow was already approaching. And somewhere between sleep and waking, between childhood and adulthood, another ordinary day in ancient Egypt quietly disappeared into the past. As one season followed another along the Nile, children came to understand that life was built from repetition. The river rose. The river fell. Seeds were planted. Crops were harvested. Homes were repaired. Food was prepared. The sun crossed the sky each day in the same patient way. And children, growing quietly within this rhythm, learned that their own lives would likely follow a similar path. In many homes throughout ancient Egypt, the day began before the first light touched the horizon. The air at that hour was cool and still. For a brief time, the world felt gentle. Children might wake to the sound of someone moving nearby. A parent preparing grain. A sibling gathering tools. The soft crackle of a fire being brought back to life after the long night. The smell of smoke often filled the room before anything else. Then came the smell of bread. These smells became part of memory. Even after years of labor, many adults probably remembered the feeling of waking as a child and smelling grain baking before sunrise. For young children, mornings often began with simple tasks. Sweeping floors. Gathering water. Cleaning cooking vessels. Collecting reeds for fuel. These responsibilities might appear small, but they were essential. A household survived because everyone contributed. No effort was considered unimportant. As children grew older, their responsibilities expanded naturally. No one stopped to announce the change. A child simply found themselves doing more. One day they carried a small basket. Later they carried a large one. One day they accompanied an adult. Later they traveled alone. In this way, independence arrived quietly. For children living near large estates owned by wealthy families or temples, daily life could involve many different kinds of labor. Some worked in gardens. Some cared for animals. Some transported supplies. Others assisted servants or craftsmen. These children often witnessed worlds very different from their own homes. They saw larger buildings. They saw fine clothing. They saw elaborate furniture and decorated walls. But despite these differences, work remained work. The sun remained hot. The days remained long. The body still became tired. A child working in a garden, for example, might spend hours carrying water. Gardens required constant care. Trees needed attention. Plants needed irrigation. The soil had to remain fertile. A child walked back and forth carrying heavy containers beneath the heat of the afternoon. The work was repetitive. The work was exhausting. But there was also beauty. The smell of flowers. The sound of water flowing through narrow channels. The shade beneath date palms. The movement of birds among branches. Beauty and labor existed side by side. For children who lived in larger cities, another experience shaped daily life. Crowds. The cities of ancient Egypt could be loud and crowded places. Merchants called to customers. Animals moved through the streets. Craftsmen worked with tools that produced constant noise. Smoke drifted upward from cooking fires and workshops. The air carried many scents at once. Fresh bread. Fish. Leather. Dust. Oil. Wood smoke. Children learned to navigate this world carefully. They learned which streets became crowded. They learned where water could be found. They learned which merchants were kind and which were impatient. They learned how to avoid danger simply by paying attention. Attention itself became a survival skill. Children listened carefully. They watched carefully. They remembered everything. Even moments of rest required awareness. At midday, when the heat became overwhelming, people sought shade wherever they could find it. Children rested beside adults. Sometimes they sat beneath trees. Sometimes beside walls. Sometimes under simple coverings made from woven reeds. These pauses rarely lasted long. But during those brief moments, the world seemed to slow. The wind softened. Voices became quieter. Movement stopped. A child might stare toward the horizon and simply breathe. Perhaps these small moments of stillness became precious because they were so rare. Children also learned about loss very early. Life in ancient Egypt could be uncertain. Poor harvests happened. Illness spread. Accidents occurred. Families understood that safety was never guaranteed. This understanding influenced how parents cared for their children and how children viewed the world around them. There was affection. There was love. But there was also caution. A mother might remind a child to stay away from deep water. A father might warn against wandering too far from home. Older siblings watched younger ones carefully. Responsibility extended throughout the family. Everyone protected everyone else whenever possible. As evening approached, daily life once again transformed. The sun lowered. The shadows grew longer. The heat slowly began to retreat. Workers gathered their tools. Animals were brought back. Boats returned to shore. Children walked home with tired feet and dusty clothing. The journey home often felt quieter than the journey out. The energy of the morning had disappeared. The body desired rest. Yet there was comfort in returning. The sight of familiar walls. The smell of cooking food. The sound of family voices. The promise that work would soon end for another day. Inside the home, evening routines unfolded with familiar precision. Water was stored. Food was prepared. Tools were cleaned and placed aside. Children assisted wherever necessary. Then, finally, came the meal. For many families, the meal remained simple. Bread. Vegetables. Beer made from grain. Occasionally fish. Occasionally fruit. The meal itself was important not because it was elaborate, but because it represented survival. Another day had been completed. Another day had been endured. Afterward, as darkness settled across the Nile Valley, conversations became softer. Stories were shared. Not stories of kings or great battles. Not stories of monuments or distant lands. Instead, families spoke about ordinary things. The condition of crops. The behavior of animals. The weather. Neighbors. Relatives. Plans for tomorrow. Children listened carefully. These conversations taught them what adulthood would eventually require. Patience. Responsibility. Endurance. Care for others. As the final oil lamps flickered and burned low, the village grew quiet. The stars appeared one by one. The Nile reflected the moonlight. A child lay down on a woven mat and felt the tiredness of the day settling into their body. Their hands hurt. Their feet hurt. Their eyes grew heavy. Outside, somewhere beyond the walls of their home, the river continued flowing through the darkness just as it always had. And while childhood in ancient Egypt offered moments of play, moments of beauty, and moments of peace, it never truly existed apart from the larger world. From the very beginning, children lived inside the same rhythms, responsibilities, and expectations that shaped everyone around them. And beneath the endless stars of the ancient world, they slowly, quietly, became adults. As the years passed beside the Nile, the difference between childhood and adulthood became harder and harder to see. There was no single morning when a child woke up and discovered that childhood had ended. There was no ceremony that marked the final day of play or the first day of responsibility. Instead, life unfolded slowly, like the river itself. One season followed another. The floods came and went. The fields changed color. Children grew taller. Their hands grew stronger. And without anyone speaking the words aloud, they found themselves standing in the places once occupied by their parents and older siblings. For many families in ancient Egypt, survival depended not on individual strength, but on the steady effort of everyone together. A household was like a small world. Every person had a role. Every action mattered. If one person became ill, others worked harder. If one task remained unfinished, the entire rhythm of the household changed. Children understood this long before they fully understood anything else. They learned that their labor was not separate from their family. Their work was an expression of belonging. This understanding began very early. A young child carrying water did not think of themselves as performing a chore. They thought of themselves as helping. A child gathering reeds did not imagine they were sacrificing their freedom. They were simply doing what everyone around them had always done. Perhaps this is why childhood in ancient Egypt felt so different from modern ideas of childhood. There was very little separation between learning, working, helping, and living. Everything existed together. During the busiest seasons of agricultural work, entire communities moved according to the same schedule. Before dawn, villages slowly awakened. The darkness retreated. Cooking fires appeared. Voices emerged from homes. Children rubbed sleep from their eyes and prepared for another day beneath the sun. The journey to the fields often took place during the coolest hours of the morning. Groups of workers walked together. Parents, children, neighbors, relatives. Their sandals pressed softly into dusty roads. The eastern sky gradually brightened. Birds called from the reeds. The Nile shimmered quietly beside them. For a brief moment, before the labor began, the world felt peaceful. Then the sun rose. And with the sun came heat. Children learned very quickly how powerful the Egyptian sun could be. The air itself seemed to grow heavy. The ground reflected heat upward. Sweat covered the body. Breathing felt slower. Thoughts became slower. Yet work continued. A child carrying grain, gathering crops, or tending animals understood that exhaustion was not unusual. It was expected. Rest, when it came, was brief and precious. Sometimes workers paused beneath a tree. Sometimes beside a wall. Sometimes beside the river itself. Children sat quietly during these moments. They drank water. They ate simple food. They listened to adults speak in tired voices. Then they stood again and returned to work. Even in difficult circumstances, however, there remained moments of quiet beauty. A child working near the Nile might stop for a moment and watch sunlight dance across the water. Another might notice a flock of birds crossing the sky. Another might feel a cool breeze arriving unexpectedly after hours of heat. These moments were small. But small moments often become the memories people carry longest. For children living in households connected to temples, life followed another set of rhythms. The temples of ancient Egypt were enormous centers of activity. Priests moved through corridors. Workers prepared food. Artisans created objects. Scribes copied texts. Animals were cared for. Supplies arrived constantly. Children who lived or worked near these places witnessed an endless cycle of labor and ritual. The smell of incense mixed with dust and stone. Footsteps echoed through large halls. Voices remained quiet and respectful. Even here, childhood remained closely tied to responsibility. Young assistants learned through observation. They carried objects. They cleaned spaces. They watched adults perform tasks that had been repeated for generations. Knowledge passed from one person to another, one day at a time. As children entered their teenage years, expectations increased further. A young boy might now work an entire day without assistance. A young girl might oversee tasks that had once been managed by older family members. People no longer saw them primarily as children. They saw them as workers, as contributors, as future adults. And perhaps this transition happened so gradually that many barely noticed it at all. There were still moments of laughter. There were still celebrations. There were still evenings when families sat together beneath the stars and shared stories. But even joy existed within the larger structure of responsibility. The ancient world allowed little space for separation. Everything belonged to the same rhythm. Work, family, rest, love, exhaustion, hope. As sunset approached once more, the landscape transformed. The intense brightness of the day softened. The heat slowly retreated. Long shadows stretched across fields and roads. Children walked home carrying tools, baskets, fishing equipment, or bundles of harvested crops. The journey home often felt different from the journey outward. In the morning, there had been anticipation. Now there was only tiredness. But there was also relief. The day had ended. They had done what was required. Ahead of them waited familiar voices, familiar food, and familiar walls. The smell of cooking fires drifted through the air. Dogs barked. Birds settled for the night. The Nile reflected the colors of the fading sky. Back inside their homes, children helped complete the final tasks of the day. Water jars were filled. Food was prepared. Tools were stored. Animals were checked. Then, slowly, the pace of life began to soften. Oil lamps flickered. Voices lowered. The darkness outside deepened. A child might sit quietly beside a parent and listen to the sounds of the evening. The crackling of a small fire. The movement of wind against the walls. The distant sound of water. The breathing of family members nearby. These sounds created a sense of safety. Tomorrow would bring more labor. Tomorrow would bring more responsibilities. But tomorrow had not yet arrived. For now, there was only this moment. This small room. This family. This quiet night beneath the stars of ancient Egypt. And so, as sleep slowly returned to the villages and cities of the Nile Valley, childhood itself continued its quiet journey toward adulthood, carried forward not by freedom, but by routine, responsibility, and the endless rhythm of ordinary life. As the Nile continued its endless journey northward, carrying water through the heart of Egypt, it also carried the lives of countless children toward adulthood. No one noticed this movement at first. A child who had once struggled to lift a water jar suddenly carried it with ease. A child who had once followed behind older workers now walked beside them. A voice became deeper. A step became steadier. A face became more familiar with exhaustion. The changes happened so gradually that they seemed almost invisible. And perhaps that was the nature of childhood in ancient Egypt. It did not end. It simply faded. During the cooler months of the year, life in the villages often became slightly more comfortable. The heat remained, but it no longer pressed against the body with the same relentless force. The air felt lighter. The wind carried the smell of fresh earth and river water. Children noticed these changes. Everyone did. Work remained difficult, but the world itself seemed more forgiving. Early in the morning, before the sun rose above the horizon, groups of workers gathered along roads and pathways leading toward fields, workshops, riverbanks, and construction sites. Children walked among them. Some carried baskets. Some carried tools. Some carried nothing at all because their task was simply to observe and learn. The roads beneath their feet were familiar. They had walked these paths hundreds of times before. They knew where the ground became uneven. They knew where trees provided shade. They knew where the wind from the river felt strongest. Familiarity itself became a form of comfort. For many children, one of the first lessons learned was patience. Everything in ancient Egypt required patience. Crops required patience. Building required patience. Fishing required patience. Learning required patience. Even growing up required patience. A child assisting a fisherman might spend hours waiting beside the river. A child helping prepare food might spend hours grinding grain. A child training as a craftsman might spend years repeating the same movements. The ancient world moved slowly. Children learned to move slowly with it. Inside workshops, this lesson became especially important. A young apprentice learned that skill did not arrive quickly. A carpenter's child spent countless days carrying wood before shaping it. A stone worker's child spent years observing before being trusted with important tools. A textile worker's child learned to spin thread long before creating finished cloth. Mistakes were expected. Patience was required. Time itself became part of the education. The workshops of ancient Egypt had their own atmosphere. The smell of sawdust. The smell of heated metal. The smell of leather and oil. The sounds of tools striking, scraping, cutting, and shaping. Children spent so many years inside these spaces that they became as familiar as home. Some probably remembered those sounds for the rest of their lives. For children living near the desert edges of the Nile Valley, the landscape created another kind of childhood. Beyond the fertile land stretched endless expanses of sand and stone. The desert was beautiful. But it was also unforgiving. Children learned where they could travel safely. They learned how quickly heat could become dangerous. They learned to respect distance. From the edge of a village, a child might stare across the desert horizon and wonder what existed beyond it. But such thoughts rarely lasted long. There was always work waiting. Always another task. Always another responsibility. In many households, children also cared for younger brothers and sisters. Older children became helpers, teachers, and protectors. A young girl might carry an infant while completing household tasks. A young boy might watch younger siblings near the riverbank. Responsibility extended downward through the family, connecting one generation to the next. This created strong bonds. But it also meant that childhood itself carried weight. Even children cared for children. As afternoon approached, the familiar heaviness of the day returned. The sunlight became brighter. The shadows became smaller. The air grew still. Workers slowed their movements. Children slowed theirs as well. In these hours, exhaustion settled over the land like a blanket. Voices became quieter. Conversations became shorter. Everyone waited for the sun to begin its slow journey downward. And eventually, it always did. The late afternoon light in ancient Egypt must have been beautiful. The harsh brightness of midday softened. The river reflected gold and orange colors. Palm trees cast long shadows. Dust hanging in the air glowed softly in the sunlight. Children walking home through this light may have felt something difficult to describe. They were tired. Their bodies ached. Their feet hurt. Yet the day was ending. And the ending of a difficult day brought its own kind of happiness. As they approached home, familiar sounds greeted them. The grinding of grain. The crackling of cooking fires. The voices of family members. The sounds of animals settling for the night. These sounds meant safety. These sounds meant rest. Inside their homes, evening routines unfolded once more. The same movements. The same tasks. The same conversations. And perhaps this repetition, which might seem exhausting to us, brought comfort to those who lived within it. The world was uncertain. Floods could fail. Illness could arrive. Accidents could happen. But the evening meal remained. The family remained. The familiar routine remained. As darkness settled over the Nile Valley, the stars appeared one by one. Children sat quietly beside parents and grandparents. They listened to stories. Not stories of heroes. Not stories of conquest. But stories of family members, neighbors, harvests, animals, and ordinary life. These stories connected generations. They reminded children that they belonged to something larger than themselves. Eventually, the oil lamps grew dim. The conversations ended. Families prepared for sleep. A child stretched out on a woven mat, feeling the tiredness of another day. Outside, the Nile flowed silently beneath the moonlight. The river did not hurry. The stars did not hurry. And childhood itself, though brief, passed with the same quiet patience that shaped every other part of life in ancient Egypt. Tomorrow would come. The work would continue. And beneath the endless sky, another ordinary day would begin once more. As the seasons continued to pass across the Nile Valley, children learned something that no one ever needed to explain to them. Life was work. Not because life lacked beauty. Not because families lacked love. But because survival itself required effort from everyone. The river provided water, yet someone had to carry it. The fields produced grain, yet someone had to plant and harvest it. Homes provided shelter, yet someone had to build and repair them. From their earliest memories, children lived inside this understanding. And because everyone around them shared the same reality, it rarely felt unusual. Before sunrise, while the world remained wrapped in darkness, villages began to awaken once again. The first sounds were often very small. The shifting of feet on packed earth floors. The movement of pottery jars. The crackling of a cooking fire coming back to life. The quiet voices of adults preparing for the day. Children woke to these sounds thousands of times throughout their lives. Eventually, the sounds became part of who they were. A child lying beneath a woven blanket might recognize each sound without opening their eyes. The sound of grain being ground. The sound of water being poured. The sound of sandals scraping against stone. The sound of a parent preparing to leave for work. These sounds meant morning. And morning meant responsibility. For many children, one of the most important lessons involved endurance. Not endurance during extraordinary moments. Not endurance during disasters. But endurance during ordinary days. The ability to continue carrying water after becoming tired. The ability to continue working after the sun became unbearable. The ability to continue walking after feet became sore. This quiet endurance shaped childhood more than any single event. Children learned not to expect comfort. Instead, they learned to appreciate moments when comfort appeared. A cool breeze from the Nile. Shade beneath a palm tree. Fresh bread after a long day. The feeling of washing dust from their hands. The sound of family members laughing during the evening. Small comforts became important because they were never guaranteed. Children who worked with animals often spent long hours away from home. A young shepherd, for example, might leave before sunrise and return only after sunset. The day unfolded slowly. Animals grazed. The sun rose higher. The heat intensified. The landscape remained mostly unchanged. Hours passed in silence. A child sitting alone beside a flock of animals might watch clouds drift slowly overhead. They might trace patterns in the dirt. They might listen to insects moving through dry grass. These moments were quiet, perhaps even peaceful. Yet peace existed alongside responsibility. The animals had to be protected. They had to be counted. They had to return safely. A mistake could affect the entire family. For children learning skilled trades, the experience was different but equally demanding. A young apprentice entered a world built upon repetition. The same movements repeated every day. The same instructions. The same corrections. The same expectations. A child learning stone carving might spend years practicing basic techniques. A child learning pottery might create countless imperfect vessels before producing a successful one. Patience was not optional. Patience was the work itself. The workshops where these children learned became familiar worlds. The smell of clay drying in the heat. The smell of wood shavings scattered across floors. The glow of furnaces. The sound of tools striking stone. The voices of experienced workers discussing methods passed down through generations. These places shaped childhood as much as family homes did. And perhaps this was one reason why childhood felt so brief. Children were always preparing for adulthood because adulthood surrounded them everywhere. There was no separate world reserved only for the young. Children listened to adult conversations. Children witnessed adult concerns. Children participated in adult responsibilities. The boundary between childhood and adulthood remained thin. Sometimes it almost disappeared entirely. Yet despite the labor and responsibility, there remained moments when children simply observed the world around them. A child walking beside the Nile at sunrise might notice how the mist floated above the water. A child carrying grain through a field might pause briefly to watch birds searching for food. A child sitting outside after sunset might stare upward at the stars and wonder about the vast darkness overhead. These moments of observation mattered. They reminded people that life contained more than labor. The natural world remained present everywhere. The wind. The river. The birds. The stars. The changing light of each day. As evening approached once again, families returned home. The roads filled with tired workers. Children walked slowly now. Their bodies carried the weight of the day. Dust covered their clothing. The heat still lingered in the air. Yet there was relief in knowing that work was ending. The villages transformed during these hours. Cooking fires appeared. Smoke drifted upward. Voices became warmer. The sounds of labor gave way to the sounds of home. Inside small houses, evening routines began. Water was stored. Food was prepared. Children completed final tasks. Then, gradually, the pace of life slowed. Families gathered together. Some sat inside. Others sat outside beneath the darkening sky. The air became cooler. The stars appeared one by one. Conversations drifted quietly through the evening. A child might rest beside a parent and simply listen. They listened to stories about difficult harvests. Stories about unusual floods. Stories about relatives who lived in distant villages. Stories about ordinary lives lived long ago. These stories rarely involved greatness. They rarely involved heroes. Instead, they celebrated endurance, patience, family, survival. Perhaps these were the qualities most admired in the ancient world. Eventually, exhaustion overcame conversation. The oil lamps burned low. Families prepared for sleep. A child lay down upon a woven mat. Their muscles ached. Their hands felt heavy. Their eyes slowly closed. Outside, beyond the walls of the home, the Nile continued flowing beneath the moonlight. The river had carried the childhoods of countless generations before them. And it would continue carrying countless more. Because in ancient Egypt, childhood was never truly a separate chapter of life. It was the beginning of a journey that had already been traveled by everyone who came before. As the Nile flowed through the heart of Egypt, carrying water from the distant south toward the Great Sea in the north, it also carried something less visible. It carried memory. Every village along its banks held memories of countless childhoods. Children who had run through the same dusty roads. Children who had carried water from the same riverbanks. Children who had fallen asleep beneath the same stars. And because life changed so slowly, one generation often resembled the generation before it. A child born in ancient Egypt entered a world that already knew exactly what was expected. The expectations were not written on walls. They did not need to be. They existed in the movement of hands. In the rhythm of daily routines. In the habits of families. In the quiet understanding shared by entire communities. A child learned these expectations almost without noticing. They learned by watching. They learned by listening. They learned by participating. Long before sunrise, while the stars still hung above the Nile Valley, movement began inside homes. The air at this hour felt cool and gentle. For a few moments, before the heat returned, the world seemed calm. A parent lit a small lamp. Someone prepared grain. Someone gathered tools. Children opened tired eyes and listened to the familiar sounds of another day beginning. There was comfort in familiarity. The same sounds. The same smells. The same routines. A child knew what would happen next because it had happened yesterday, and the day before that, and countless times before. In many ways, predictability became a form of security. Outside, the sky slowly brightened. The eastern horizon turned pale. Birds began to move through the reeds. The Nile reflected the first light of day. Children stepped outside and joined the movement of the world around them. Some walked toward fields. Some toward workshops. Some toward the river. Others remained at home to complete household tasks. No matter where they went, responsibility accompanied them. For children who spent their days in the fields, the landscape itself became familiar in every detail. They knew where the soil remained soft after flooding. They knew where the wind felt strongest. They knew which paths became muddy after irrigation. They knew where birds gathered during different seasons. This knowledge was practical. But it was also intimate. The land was not separate from life. The land was life. A child planting seeds beneath the morning sun might not think of themselves as participating in history. They were simply helping their family survive. Yet these ordinary moments, repeated across thousands of villages over thousands of years, became the true foundation of ancient Egypt. Not monuments. Not palaces. Not great victories, but ordinary people performing ordinary tasks. And among those ordinary people were countless children. As the morning progressed, the temperature slowly increased. The cool air disappeared. The sunlight became stronger. The earth released the warmth it had stored. Children adjusted without thinking. They covered their heads. They searched for shade when possible. They conserved energy. The body learned these habits through experience. Experience itself became a teacher. There were few opportunities to avoid hardship. So children learned to live beside it. Sometimes, while working, children sang quietly. The songs were simple. They helped establish rhythm. They made repetitive work feel shorter. The sound of singing drifted across fields and riverbanks. Not loud. Not dramatic. Just human voices accompanying human labor. Perhaps these songs carried comfort. Perhaps they reminded children that they were not alone. Even difficult work became easier when shared. In workshops, another kind of rhythm existed. The steady tapping of tools. The scraping of wood. The shaping of clay. The sharpening of metal. Children spent years surrounded by these sounds. Eventually, the sounds themselves became familiar and reassuring. A workshop was not merely a place of labor. It was a place of learning. A place of identity. A place where children slowly discovered who they would become. A young apprentice might spend an entire day repeating a single task. Again. And again. And again. The repetition could feel endless. Yet through repetition came skill. Through skill came purpose. And purpose brought respect. For girls managing household responsibilities, repetition shaped life in similar ways. Bread had to be prepared every day. Water had to be collected every day. Children had to be cared for every day. Clothing had to be repaired. Food had to be stored. The household itself required constant attention. There were no days without work. Yet there was satisfaction in completing necessary tasks. A clean floor. Fresh bread. A full water jar. These small accomplishments carried meaning. As afternoon approached, the familiar heaviness returned. The sun stood high above the Nile Valley. Shadows became small. The air seemed to stop moving. Children felt the weight of the day inside their bodies. Their arms became tired. Their feet became sore. Their thoughts slowed. Everyone waited for evening. And eventually, evening always arrived. The sunlight softened. The shadows lengthened. The unbearable heat began to retreat. A cool breeze sometimes drifted from the river. Children noticed immediately. Everyone noticed. Relief spread quietly through the landscape. The journey home began. Perhaps this was the most peaceful part of the day. The work was finished. The hardest hours had passed. The sky turned golden. Dust rose gently beneath tired feet. Families walked together. There was no need to hurry. Ahead waited food, shelter, and rest. As darkness slowly settled across Egypt, familiar evening rituals unfolded once more. Cooking fires glowed. Voices softened. Children completed their final tasks. Then they rested. Some families sat outside their homes. Others climbed to rooftops where the air remained cooler. Children listened to stories. They listened to adults discuss crops, weather, and family concerns. They listened to the sounds of insects and distant animals. They listened to the silence that gradually covered the land. Above them stretched the same sky their ancestors had known. The same stars. The same moon. The same endless darkness. A child lying beneath that sky might not think about history. They might not think about the future. They might simply feel tired, safe, and ready for sleep. Tomorrow would come soon enough. And when it arrived, childhood in ancient Egypt would continue exactly as it always had, quietly, steadily, and never truly free. As another night settled over the Nile Valley, the air slowly cooled and the world became quieter. The heat of the day remained trapped inside mud brick walls and stone pathways for many hours after sunset. Yet eventually, the warmth softened. A gentle breeze moved across the river. Palm leaves rustled in the darkness. The sounds of labor, which had filled every hour of daylight, gradually disappeared. For children in ancient Egypt, nighttime was often the only time when the body could truly rest. The hands that had carried water. The feet that had walked dusty roads. The shoulders that had lifted baskets. The eyes that had stared into bright sunlight. All of them finally became still. But even during these peaceful hours, childhood remained surrounded by the realities of ordinary life. A child sleeping inside a small home might awaken briefly during the night. Perhaps they heard a baby crying. Perhaps they heard someone coughing. Perhaps they heard the distant sound of animals moving outside. Or perhaps they heard the wind itself, passing gently over the rooftops and through the narrow streets of the village. For a few moments, they might lie awake. Then, comforted by the familiar sounds around them, they would return to sleep. When dawn arrived once again, it arrived quietly. The stars faded. The eastern horizon brightened. The Nile reflected the first pale light of morning. And throughout Egypt, another day began. The beginning of the day was often the most peaceful time. The air was cool. The world was calm. The birds had begun to sing, but the overwhelming heat had not yet arrived. Children walked through this brief period of comfort carrying tools, baskets, water jars, and supplies. Their bodies were still rested. Their minds were still quiet. But everyone knew that the long hours of labor lay ahead. For many children, one of the most important lessons of life involved understanding time. Not time measured by clocks. Not time measured by numbers. But time measured by nature. They learned to read the color of the sky. They learned to observe the position of the sun. They learned to recognize the changing seasons by watching the Nile. They learned when birds migrated. They learned when crops matured. The natural world became their calendar. And because they observed it every day, they understood it deeply. A child helping in the fields could often predict weather changes simply by noticing the wind. A child working on the river could recognize dangerous currents before others saw them. A child caring for animals could detect illness through small changes in behavior. This knowledge did not come from books. It came from attention. And attention was one of the greatest skills a child in ancient Egypt could possess. Children learned to pay attention because their lives depended upon it. They paid attention to adults. They paid attention to animals. They paid attention to tools. They paid attention to weather. They paid attention to danger. This constant observation shaped the way they understood the world. Perhaps this is why childhood itself felt so serious. Not because children lacked happiness, but because they could not afford carelessness. A mistake while carrying water might waste precious resources. A mistake in the fields might damage crops. A mistake near the river could become dangerous. Responsibility existed everywhere. And yet, despite this, moments of wonder still appeared. A child might pause while walking and watch sunlight spreading across the Nile. A child might notice thousands of birds rising from the reeds at once. A child might look upward during the night and see the stars stretching endlessly overhead. These moments required no explanation. They simply existed. And perhaps they offered a kind of comfort. For children living in larger communities, social life also formed an important part of daily experience. They knew their neighbors. They knew the families living nearby. They knew which houses baked the best bread and which families owned the strongest animals. They recognized familiar faces everywhere they went. Communities were closely connected. People depended upon one another. Children grew up surrounded by this network of relationships. If a family struggled, neighbors often noticed. If someone became ill, others helped when possible. If a child made a mistake, everyone heard about it. This closeness created both security and responsibility. A child's actions reflected not only themselves, but also their family. Reputation mattered. Respect mattered. Reliability mattered. These values were learned slowly, through daily experience. As children entered adolescence, their worlds became even smaller and larger at the same time. Smaller because responsibilities increased, leaving less time for play. Larger because they began to understand the wider concerns of adult life. They learned about harvest failures. They learned about taxes. They learned about illness. They learned about the worries that kept adults awake during the night. The transition happened quietly. One evening, a child sat beside adults and listened. The next evening, they participated in the conversation. No one announced the change. It simply happened. As afternoon once again gave way to evening, the landscape transformed. The harsh sunlight softened. The air became cooler. The shadows stretched across fields and roads. Children walking home often experienced a feeling difficult to describe. They were exhausted. Yet they were also relieved. The day had demanded much. But the day had ended. They watched smoke rising from village homes. They heard the sounds of evening meals being prepared. They smelled bread baking. They heard the distant sounds of families gathering together. These familiar experiences created a sense of belonging. A sense of continuity. A sense that, despite all the hardships of life, some things remained constant. Later, after the evening meal had ended and the oil lamps burned low, children prepared once more for sleep. Some slept indoors. Others climbed onto rooftops beneath the stars. The night air moved softly around them. The Nile flowed somewhere beyond the darkness. The world became quiet again. A child closed their eyes. Their body ached. Their hands were rough. Their feet were tired. But they were home. And for one more night, beneath the endless sky of ancient Egypt, that was enough. Tomorrow would come. The river would continue flowing. The sun would rise. And childhood, woven tightly into the fabric of ordinary life, would continue its slow and silent journey toward adulthood. As the years passed quietly along the banks of the Nile, children learned that the world around them rarely changed quickly. The river followed its ancient path. The sun rose and set. The fields were planted and harvested. The seasons arrived and departed. And within this steady rhythm, childhood unfolded with a patience that is difficult to imagine today. A child born into a farming family often spent their entire early life surrounded by the same sights. The same fields. The same trees. The same roads. The same riverbank. They knew every bend in the irrigation canals. They knew where the soil became soft after flooding. They knew which paths remained shaded during the hottest hours of the day. This familiarity created a deep connection to place. The land was not simply where they lived. It was part of who they were. In the early hours of morning, before the sun climbed high above the eastern horizon, children often experienced the most peaceful moments of their day. The air remained cool. The earth still held traces of the night's moisture. Birds moved through the reeds beside the river. The sounds of labor had not yet become overwhelming. A child walking toward the fields at this hour might feel almost rested. Their sandals pressed gently against the dusty ground. The sky slowly brightened. The Nile shimmered softly beside them. For a few moments, there was silence. Then the work began. For children who worked in agriculture, the body itself became a tool. Hands carried. Feet walked. Shoulders lifted. Backs bent. Muscles strengthened through repetition rather than exercise. No one trained for labor. Life itself was the training. A child learned how to carry weight by carrying weight. A child learned endurance by enduring. Over time, difficult tasks became ordinary. This transformation happened so gradually that it often went unnoticed. One day, a basket felt heavy. A year later, the same basket felt light. One season, walking to the fields felt exhausting. Several seasons later, the journey required little thought at all. The body adapted because it had no choice. Children working near irrigation canals often spent hours managing water. This task required patience and attention. Water had to move at the correct time. Fields had to receive enough moisture. Channels required maintenance. A child standing ankle-deep in mud beneath the hot sun might spend an entire afternoon performing work that appeared repetitive and unimportant. Yet without such work, crops would fail. The entire system depended upon countless small efforts. Perhaps this was one of the greatest truths of ancient Egypt. Its monuments appeared grand. Its rulers appeared powerful. But everyday life depended upon ordinary people performing ordinary tasks. And among those ordinary people were millions of children. For children who lived near the river itself, the Nile remained both a companion and a teacher. The river changed throughout the year. Its color changed. Its speed changed. Its sound changed. Children noticed these differences. They learned to recognize the smell of rising flood waters. They learned to observe currents. They learned where fish gathered and where boats could travel safely. The river was alive. And because it was alive, it demanded attention and respect. Many children probably spent countless hours simply watching it. Watching sunlight dance across the water. Watching boats drift past. Watching birds rise from the reeds. Watching the endless movement of the current. Even within lives shaped by labor, there remained moments for observation. Moments for thought. Moments for quiet wonder. As children grew older, they also became more aware of the hardships faced by adults. A poor harvest affected everyone. Illness affected everyone. Shortages affected everyone. There was no separate world protecting children from these realities. They witnessed concern in the faces of their parents. They heard conversations spoken late at night. They understood when food became scarce. They understood when labor became more difficult. This awareness encouraged maturity. Not because children wished to become adults, but because circumstances required it. In many households, older children became essential sources of support. They cared for younger siblings. They completed household tasks. They assisted parents whose bodies had become tired from years of labor. Responsibility expanded naturally. A child who had once been cared for became a caretaker. A child who had once followed instructions began giving them. The transition happened quietly. And because it happened quietly, it felt natural. As afternoon sunlight spread across the Nile Valley, the familiar exhaustion of the day settled into every movement. The air grew thick with heat. The fields shimmered. Conversations became shorter. Children continued working because everyone continued working. There was comfort in shared effort. No one suffered alone. No one rested alone. The entire community moved together through the difficult hours of the day. Eventually, the shadows began to lengthen. The sun slowly descended. The world softened. Children walking home experienced a kind of relief that required no words. The work was finished. The tools could be set aside. The burden of responsibility could rest, if only for a few hours. As they approached home, familiar sights greeted them. Smoke rising from cooking fires. Neighbors returning from work. Animals settling for the evening. The glow of sunlight reflecting against mud brick walls. These ordinary sights brought comfort. They meant safety. They meant family. They meant rest. After the evening meal, children often remained awake for a short time. The night air felt cooler now. The stars appeared one by one above the Nile. Adults spoke quietly nearby. Someone laughed softly. Someone told a story already heard many times before. Children listened anyway. Familiar stories carried their own kind of comfort. Eventually, exhaustion overcame conversation. Oil lamps dimmed. The sounds of the village faded. A child stretched out upon a woven mat and closed their eyes. Tomorrow would resemble today. And today had resembled yesterday. Yet within this endless repetition existed an entire human life. A life of work. A life of family. A life of responsibility. A life shaped by the river, the sun, and the quiet understanding that childhood was never a time apart from the world. It was simply the first chapter of learning how to live within it. As another season slowly unfolded across the Nile Valley, children continued to move through a world that asked much of them and explained very little. There were few long lessons. Few speeches. Few moments when adults sat down and described what life would become. Instead, children learned by waking each morning and stepping back into the same rhythm that had shaped their parents, grandparents, and countless generations before them. The lessons were all around them. The river taught patience. The sun taught endurance. The fields taught responsibility. And the family taught everything else. For many children, one of the earliest memories of life was the sound of work beginning. Before they could read. Before they could understand the passing of seasons. Before they could carry heavy loads. They heard the sounds of labor. The grinding of grain. The movement of water jars. The footsteps of adults preparing for the day. These sounds formed the background of childhood itself. And because they were always present, they became comforting. A silent morning might have felt strange. Perhaps even frightening. The ordinary noises of labor meant that life was continuing as it should. As children grew older, they began to understand the importance of these routines. They saw how every action connected to another. Water collected in the morning became bread prepared in the afternoon. Fields tended during one season became food stored during the next. Animals cared for throughout the year provided labor, milk, or security. Nothing existed alone. Everything depended upon everything else. This understanding shaped how children viewed themselves. They were not separate from the household. They were part of it. They were not observers. They were participants. A child carrying a basket of grain was contributing to the survival of the family. A child gathering reeds was contributing to the survival of the family. A child caring for younger siblings was contributing to the survival of the family. Even the smallest tasks mattered. Perhaps this sense of purpose provided a kind of strength. Not happiness in the way we often imagine it, but a feeling of belonging. A feeling of necessity. For children living near major towns and cities, another lesson became important. The world was larger than their own household. Markets introduced children to strangers. Travelers arrived from distant places. Merchants carried goods from regions they would never see. A child standing in a busy marketplace might hear unfamiliar accents. They might see unusual clothing. They might smell spices or foods they had never encountered before. For a brief moment, the world seemed enormous. Yet after the market emptied and the travelers departed, ordinary life returned. The household remained. The work remained. The responsibilities remained. In this way, childhood balanced between curiosity and obligation. Curiosity encouraged children to observe. Obligation required them to continue working. For some children, especially those training as scribes, daily life involved long hours of concentration rather than physical labor. But this did not mean life was easier. A young scribe sat for hours copying symbols. Mistakes required correction. Correction required repetition. Repetition required patience. Their backs became sore. Their hands became tired. Their eyes strained in the dim light of classrooms and workspaces. The labor of the mind carried its own form of exhaustion. And just like the labor of the fields, it demanded discipline. Discipline itself became one of the defining characteristics of childhood. Children learned to control their emotions. They learned to complete tasks even when tired. They learned to continue despite discomfort. They learned to place responsibility above personal desire. This was not because adults wished to deny children happiness. It was because survival required discipline. The entire structure of society depended upon people fulfilling their roles. And children learned those roles early. As the years passed, many children discovered that they remembered very little of a life before responsibility. Perhaps they remembered playing games with siblings. Perhaps they remembered sitting beside their mothers while bread baked. Perhaps they remembered falling asleep while listening to the voices of adults. But these memories existed alongside work, not separate from it. Childhood and labor grew together. One did not replace the other. They existed at the same time. Even moments of celebration reflected this reality. During festivals, communities gathered together. There was music. There was food. There was laughter. Children participated with excitement and joy. Yet preparations for these events required work. Cleaning. Cooking. Carrying. Organizing. The celebration itself emerged from labor. And when the celebration ended, labor returned once again. As afternoon slowly became evening, the familiar transformation occurred across the Nile Valley. The sunlight softened. The air cooled. The shadows lengthened. Children stopped their work and began walking home. Their bodies carried the memory of the day. Their hands were rough. Their feet were tired. Their clothing smelled of dust, smoke, earth, and sunlight. Yet the journey home brought comfort. The hardest part of the day had passed. Ahead waited family. Ahead waited food. Ahead waited rest. As they entered their villages, familiar sounds surrounded them. The crackling of cooking fires. The voices of neighbors. The sounds of animals settling for the night. The distant movement of the Nile itself. These sounds meant that all was well. For one more day, the household had survived. For one more day, everyone had returned home. Later, as darkness spread across the land and the stars filled the sky, children prepared for sleep. Some slept inside. Others slept upon rooftops beneath the open air. The night wind moved gently around them. The heat of the day slowly disappeared. A child closed their eyes and listened. The breathing of family members. The soft movement of the wind. The distant sound of water. These sounds had surrounded them since birth. And if fortune allowed, they would continue hearing them for many years to come. Tomorrow would arrive soon. The sun would rise. The work would begin again. And childhood, woven inseparably into the ordinary life of ancient Egypt, would continue its quiet and patient journey forward. As childhood slowly gave way to youth, the days themselves seemed to move more quickly. The seasons still followed their ancient patterns. The Nile still rose and fell. The sun still crossed the sky with the same patient certainty. Yet for the children growing beside the river, something had changed. Their bodies had grown stronger. Their responsibilities had grown heavier. And the small spaces where play once existed had become more difficult to find. This change rarely happened all at once. A child did not wake one morning and suddenly become an adult. Instead, adulthood arrived through hundreds of ordinary moments. The first time a father trusted a son to work alone in the fields. The first time a daughter prepared the evening meal without assistance. The first time an older sibling remained responsible for younger children throughout an entire day. These moments passed quietly. But they remained important. For many young people in ancient Egypt, the teenage years were not a period of discovery. They were a period of preparation. Preparation for work. Preparation for family responsibilities. Preparation for a future that was often already visible. A young fisherman could look at his father's hands and imagine his own future. A young farmer could watch older workers in the fields and understand what awaited him. A young woman helping manage a household could see the path unfolding before her. There was uncertainty in life. But there was often very little uncertainty about responsibility. Perhaps this certainty created both comfort and burden. Comfort because the future seemed familiar. Burden because the future seemed unavoidable. As the years passed, children also became increasingly aware of the physical cost of labor. They saw it in the adults around them. They noticed tired movements. They noticed sore backs. They noticed hands marked by years of work. They noticed how older workers paused longer when climbing stairs or carrying heavy loads. Children learned an important truth. The body remembered everything. Every journey to the river. Every basket carried. Every field harvested. Every tool lifted. The body kept its own record of life. And yet, despite this understanding, the work continued. Because it had to. For children working in agriculture, some of the longest days occurred during harvest season. The entire community seemed to move with greater urgency. The fields had to be cleared. The grain had to be gathered. The food that would sustain the household depended upon these efforts. Children worked beside parents, relatives, and neighbors. The air filled with dust. The sun burned overhead. The hours stretched endlessly. Sometimes a child might stop for a moment and look toward the Nile. The river flowed quietly, unchanged by human exhaustion. Birds moved above the reeds. The sky remained clear and bright. The world itself seemed patient. Only human beings hurried. As afternoon turned toward evening, the atmosphere changed. The heat slowly loosened its grip. Shadows stretched across the fields. The sounds of labor became softer. Workers moved more slowly now. Children moved more slowly too. The day's energy had been spent. Yet there was satisfaction in this exhaustion. The work had been completed. The harvest had been gathered. The family would eat. In ancient Egypt, survival itself could create a sense of accomplishment. For children living in cities, another kind of fatigue developed. The constant movement. The constant noise. The constant demands of work. A child working in a workshop or market might spend entire days surrounded by voices. Merchants bargaining. Craftsmen shouting instructions. Animals moving through crowded streets. Customers arriving and departing. The city rarely became quiet. Perhaps this is why nighttime felt so important. Night offered something precious. Silence. As darkness settled across the cities and villages of Egypt, the pace of life finally slowed. Cooking fires burned low. Conversations became softer. Children completed their final tasks and prepared for rest. Some climbed onto rooftops. Others remained inside their homes. Wherever they slept, they shared the same sky. The stars above ancient Egypt must have appeared endless. Without artificial light, the heavens stretched across the darkness in astonishing detail. Children saw these stars every night. They grew up beneath them. They measured their lives beneath them. Perhaps they found comfort in their familiarity. No matter how difficult the day had been, the stars always returned. A child lying awake beneath the night sky might think about tomorrow's work. They might think about their family. They might think about nothing at all. Exhaustion often leaves little room for complicated thoughts. Sometimes, being tired is enough. As children grew older, they also began to understand the emotional responsibilities carried by adults. Parents worried about food. They worried about floods. They worried about illness. They worried about the future of their children. Young people witnessed these worries. Gradually, they began carrying their own. Responsibility was not only physical. It was emotional as well. To care for a family. To support a household. To contribute to the survival of others. These obligations shaped the heart as much as they shaped the body. And still, life continued to offer moments of quiet beauty. A cool wind after a day of unbearable heat. The smell of fresh bread rising from an oven. The sound of laughter shared between siblings. The sight of moonlight reflecting on the Nile. The feeling of resting muscles after long hours of labor. These moments were small. But perhaps because they were small, they mattered deeply. As the night grew darker and the voices around them slowly disappeared, children drifted toward sleep. Tomorrow would bring more work. Tomorrow would bring more responsibilities. Tomorrow would look very much like today. And in ancient Egypt, that familiarity was not always something to fear. Sometimes, after a long day beneath the sun, familiarity itself became a kind of comfort. So beneath the endless stars, beside the eternal river, another day quietly disappeared into memory. And childhood continued its slow, patient journey toward the world of adults. As the night deepens over the Nile Valley, the world grows quieter than it has been all day. The cooking fires have long since faded into embers. The footsteps have stopped. The voices that filled homes, fields, workshops, and riverbanks have gradually disappeared into silence. The Nile continues to flow. It flowed before these children were born. It flowed while they grew. and it will continue flowing long after their footsteps have faded from the dusty roads. Tonight, somewhere in ancient Egypt, a child lies asleep beneath the stars. Their hands are tired from the day's work. Their feet are sore from long walks beneath the sun. Their breathing is slow and peaceful now. Around them, their family sleeps. The warm desert wind moves softly across the rooftops. Palm leaves rustle gently in the darkness. Far away, water touches the riverbank with a sound so quiet it almost disappears. Tomorrow, before sunrise, the world will awaken again. The grain will be ground. The boats will return to the river. The fields will wait beneath the morning light. And another ordinary day will begin. But for now, there is only rest. There is only the cool air of the night. There is only the endless sky above the Nile. Perhaps that is the deepest truth about childhood in ancient Egypt. It was never truly free. It was never separate from work, family, responsibility, or survival. Yet within that life, there were still moments of comfort. The smell of fresh bread at dawn. The sound of parents speaking softly in the evening. The feeling of cool wind after a day of unbearable heat. The sight of stars reflected in the river. The simple relief of returning home after a long day. These small moments, repeated over countless generations, became the quiet heart of ordinary life. And now, as the moon hangs above the sleeping villages and the river moves steadily through the darkness, even those memories begin to grow soft. The fields become still. The roads become empty. The workshops become silent. The children sleep. The families sleep. The ancient world itself seems to close its eyes. And beneath the endless stars, beside the eternal Nile, history slowly, gently, drifts into silence.